Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Dust to Verdict. I'm your host, James Nevin, a partner at the law firm of Brayton Purcell LLP. This podcast is dedicated to the epidemic of accelerated silicosis in artificial stone countertop fabrication workers. In each episode, we explore important topics and issues about this occupational health epidemic, as well as the associated lawsuits.
So to understand the hidden dangers of artificial stone, we first have to understand what exactly is artificial stone. So artificial stone, also known as quartz or engineered, composite, synthetic, and similar names, is essentially a stone slab that looks just like a natural stone slab. So it might look like granite or marble or slate or porcelain, but artificial stone is very much artificial. Artificial stone slab typically contains 90 to 95% silica, and it's crystalline silica. And unlike natural stone, this is a much higher silica content. So granite, for example, is typically 45% silica. Slate might be 30%. Porcelain, for example, is only 15% silica or less. Marble is often only 3% silica, limestone 2% silica. So most natural stone has significantly less silica than artificial stone. Additionally, the silica that is in natural stone is significantly larger, essentially huge, compared to the nano-sized silica that's in artificial stone. And the reason for that is the silica in artificial stone comes from quartz, which is a rock. It is mined out of the ground, but it's not added to the artificial stone in its natural mined state. Before it is added to artificial stone, it is intentionally crushed and pulverized. And so that the effect of that is the silica in artificial stone, in addition to being extremely high content of the stone, it's nano-sized, very, very, very small. Additionally, the other 5 to 10% of the constituents of artificial stone are essentially metals and other toxins that produce VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. So essentially, the entire ingredients in artificial stone are all toxic materials. The artificial stone is made into a slab. And so the end result of the artificial stone slab manufacturing process is a large rectangular stone slab that looks the same as a natural stone slab that is quarried and chiseled out of the ground. But with both natural stone and artificial stone, the process does not stop there. We don't just take a large rectangular artificial stone slab and put it on the top of our kitchen and bathroom countertops. So before the stone can be installed in a kitchen or bathroom, it has to be fabricated. And whether it's natural stone or artificial stone, it has this fabrication step. And so for many, many decades before artificial stone was even invented, natural stone slabs, after they were delivered from the quarries, would go to fabrication shops where they would be cut and polished and ground and drilled to the appropriate size and dimension of the eventual countertop that they're going to be installed on, and space for the sink, for example, holes for the plumbing, or nice smooth edges. So that fabrication process has existed for many decades, and it worked fine with natural stone. A typical natural stone fabrication worker might wear N95 dust mask, or they might wear no mask at all. They might use wet equipment, or they might use dry equipment. And the end result is most natural stone workers could fabricate using any of those methods or not throughout their whole career, and typically they would not develop any sort of disease. Because artificial stone was then introduced into the market, into the same existing fabrication process. And the artificial stone slab manufacturers and suppliers allegedly introduced this product into the fabrication market without any warnings, without any special training, without any acknowledgement that artificial stone is in fact different than natural stone. And it's different to the fabricators because of the high content silica, because of the nano size of the silica, and because of the other toxins that are included in the artificial stone. The end result of that is when fabricating artificial stone rather than natural stone, the fabrication workers are exposed then to an extremely high level of nano-sized silica fibers and other toxins that they then breathe in. Now, studies from OSHA, from NIOSH, which is the scientific wing of OSHA, the organizations that we have federally to protect workers in the workplace, and Cal-OSHA, which is the California version of OSHA, and every state has their version of OSHA. And say, for example, studies at Georgia Tech, studies out of Australia from Safe Work Australia and other organizations, medical organizations in Australia, essentially studies from all over the world, including actually most recently studies funded by the Natural Stone Institute and the ISFA, the International Service Fabricators Association. Both of them are lobby organizations funded by the artificial stone manufacturers and suppliers. A recent study from them out of Yale came to the same conclusion as the studies from NIOSH and Georgia Tech and Australia, which in short, what these scientists have found that when a fabrication worker is fabricating artificial stone, if they're using dry methods, the levels of dust that they're breathing in are in extreme excess of the OSHA PELs. But also, when using wet methods, which are the dust control methods recommended by the artificial stone slab manufacturers and suppliers, so wet methods being wet equipment, for example, wet saws and other wet tools. When using wet equipment to fabricate artificial stone, unlike natural stone, all these studies, including the studies out of Yale from the slab manufacturers, have found that the levels are still far above the PEL, even with wet methods. The PEL, also known as the permissible exposure level, is a level that OSHA sets, and other global organizations have similar levels that they set throughout the world. But the PEL specifically is the level that OSHA sets of allowed level of any toxin or carcinogen in the workplace. And they have this for many, many different toxins and carcinogens. So, for example, there's one for asbestos. There's one for beryllium. There's one for benzene. But in focusing on the PEL for silica, the PEL for silica, just like PELs for other toxins and carcinogen, is not intended to represent a safe level. It's simply a regulatory level, a compromise between scientists and industry, where scientists will say, the level should be 0, and industry says, well, you're going to put us out of business. And so they compromise at a level and say, well, okay, the level at least has to be below this. So the PEL for silica, first off, is not a safe level. It's also a very old level. It was established long ago based on natural stone. So it wasn't even designed to address artificial stone. But even applying this out-of-date level that is still too high and is still not intended to be a safe level, when fabricating artificial stone, even with wet methods, the levels are above that. But the problem is that at this point, every geography, so pick a country, pick a state, pick a city, on a various different timelines, artificial stone has displaced natural stone in the market. Because to a consumer wanting a beautiful kitchen or bathroom countertop, artificial stone generally is a little bit better than natural stone. It's not actually cheaper. However, it's more durable. It's more scratch resistant. It's more uniform. It tends not to crack. And so consumers, not knowing the risk to fabrication workers by the introduction into their fabrication shop of this artificial stone product instead of natural stone, a consumer doesn't know that it's posing a risk to workers, so the consumer prefers that product. The end result is that many fabrication shops no longer fabricate any natural stone, or to the extent that they still fabricate natural stone, it's much less natural stone. And for the most part, they're fabricating this high silica, nano-sized silica, and other toxic compound product, artificial stone. So the end result of that, according to numerous peer-reviewed published medical literature from around the globe, is there has been not just an epidemic, but a pandemic of accelerated silicosis among artificial stone fabrication workers. First in other countries such as Israel, Italy, Spain, China, Australia, but now also in the US. And so we've seen more recently, as artificial stone has become more popular in the United States, a new epidemic of artificial stone accelerated silicosis in fabrication workers in the US. And so, for example, in California, the CDPH, which is the California Department of Public Health, now maintains a engineered stone silicosis surveillance dashboard. That's at www.cdph.cal.gov. Under their programs section, you can get to their surveillance dashboard, or you could simply just Google CDPH silicosis dashboard, and you'll see this dashboard, and they update it weekly. And so currently, the California Department of Public Health, for example, has tracked, just in the last few years, 327 confirmed silicosis cases among artificial stone fabrication workers in California. Of those, 17 have died. They are very young workers. The median age is 46. You'll see that most of the workers are male. In California, 98% of the workers with silicosis have been Latino. 35 have received lung transplants. 26 are waiting for a lung transplant. And 6 have been found not eligible for a lung transplant. You'll see that these numbers dramatically increase as we release more episodes. Today in episode 3, we will discuss silicosis. What is it? How do we understand it? Silicosis is the oldest occupational disease in history. For example, the Egyptian pyramids were built by slaves who, because they had to chisel and quarry the rock for the pyramids, died of silicosis. If we fast forward in time to the 1930s in the United States, we have what's known as the Hawk's Nest incident. In this incident, we had hundreds of mostly black and migrant workers who died relatively quickly from accelerated silicosis while digging and blasting a tunnel. And then over the next 2 years, many more, thousands of them died as well. If we fast forward further in time to 1997, in the country of Israel, we have the first publication in a peer-reviewed journal regarding artificial stone silicosis. Dr. Mordecai Kramer published an article in Chest magazine, which is an internationally renowned and well-recognized journal. He published an article regarding artificial stone silicosis. And he reported on a cohort of artificial stone fabrication workers who were working with Caesar stone who had developed accelerated silicosis. If we fast forward again in time to the United States in 2024, we see a massive increase in the use of artificial stone in the United States. And what then followed that was a massive increase in accelerated silicosis among fabrication workers. So according to the California Department of Public Health, they've chronicled approximately 336 artificial stone fabrication workers who have developed accelerated silicosis as of July 2025. And of those, 41 have received a lung transplant, 35 are on the transplant list waiting for a lung transplant, and 19 have died waiting for a transplant, and approximately 8 have been found to be ineligible for a transplant, but they need one. The average age of diagnosis is 46, though there's many patients who are significantly younger than that. So silicosis at its core is caused by respirable crystalline silica, or RCS for short. This means that silica is simply very small particles that the most common way that we can think about it is beach sand is very large silica. RCS is much smaller than beach sand. RCS, or respirable crystalline silica, is an ingredient in natural stone. It is also an ingredient in artificial stone with significant differences. And so the main differences between the silica that's in natural stone and artificial stone is threefold. One is extremely high content in artificial stone, up to 95% silica, versus varying ranges for natural stone, which can range as low as 1% silica. Secondly, the RCS that is in artificial stone is intentionally pulverized to nano-sized in the manufacturing process before it is put into artificial stone slab. And so the silica in the artificial stone is not only much higher content, it's much smaller. And then the third component of artificial stone silica is the other 5 to 10% of the ingredients in artificial stone are various other metals and toxins and volatile organic compounds that are used basically in the resins and in the coloring agents to make the artificial stone, mimic the look of natural stone. And so the artificial stone RCS that is released, in addition to being high content and nano size, is also coated with these other resins that are also toxic. And so this sort of toxic soup of specialized RCS that is released from artificial stone is causing accelerated silicosis. And so we breathe in through our nose and our mouth, and the air gets down into our lungs and gets down into what's called our terminal bronchioles. One way to think about it is like an upside down oak tree. And as the branches of that tree get farther and farther out from the base, they get thinner and thinner and thinner. At those tips of the bronchioles, at the terminal bronchioles, we have what's called our alveolar air sacs. And the average adult human male has about 500 million of these. These alveolar air sacs is where our breathing occurs. So as we breathe in, the oxygen in the air that we breathe is diffusing across the alveolar air sacs into our capillaries to be transported around our body to, for example, metabolize our muscles. That process then releases carbon dioxide, which then goes back to the lungs through the alveolar air sacs to be breathed out, in and out. Oxygen, carbon dioxide going back and forth. The problem with silicosis is these alveolar air sacs become scarred over by the RCS, and therefore the scarred over alveolar air sac can no longer do its job. So traditionally, in a trade such as a miner or a sandblaster or a natural stone countertop fabrication worker, a worker might, after many decades of working, maybe with a mask, maybe without a mask, maybe working dry, maybe working wet, but after many, many decades, they might develop chronic silicosis. And this is an example of what chronic silicosis looks like under an X-ray on the left and on the right side under a CT scan. And it requires a specialized radiologist to review a specialty scan to determine if the worker has chronic silicosis. Now, in the United States, since legislation starting in the 1930s, and that was strengthened in the 1970s, United States, up until recently, chronic silicosis was relatively rare. But in the globe as a whole, there was still probably around 100,000 cases of chronic silicosis diagnosed every year. So very much not an eradicated disease, but very much reduced in the United States, at least. That has all changed with artificial stone. The first stage of silicosis is called lymph node silicosis. This is the most minor stage. Most treating doctors are going to miss it. But if you have a specialist who reviews HRCT, they will find lymph node silicosis. And lymph node silicosis is a silicosis in the lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are the sort of drainage nodes of our body that run throughout our body. And most common example would be if we have a really bad cold, the lymph nodes on the sides of our throat might swell up, or behind our ear. Well, we also have lymph nodes in our lungs. And silica, one of the first scarring diseases that it causes in the lungs is scarring of the lymph nodes, so lymph node silicosis. This disease doesn't cause any impairment. A worker's not going to know that they have it. But a specialty doctor looking at this knows that this is a marker of extreme exposure to RCS, most typically from artificial stone. And it's an indication that the worker has already been exposed to far too much silicosis, and that they need to be provided with either state-of-the-art safety equipment or be given the opportunity to change professions. Now, if exposure were to cease in lymph node silicosis, a large majority of those workers would not go on to develop the next level of silicosis. The next level of silicosis is simple silicosis. And simple silicosis, again, is diagnosed by a specialist looking at a high-resolution CT. It can sometimes be diagnosed by regular CT or by chest X-ray, but those devices will typically miss it, and so an HRCT is recommended. Simple silicosis, again, in a traditional worker like a sandblaster or a natural stone fabrication worker, is something that would typically not be developed until after many decades, and the disease may simply stay at that rate. Unfortunately, what we're finding with artificial stone fabrication workers is lymph node silicosis is quickly transitioning to simple silicosis, which is then quickly transitioning to a next level. So with simple silicosis, a worker may or may not experience symptoms. So they may experience shortness of breath, cough, fatigue. They may think that they have asthma or pneumonia or some other problem, or they may feel perfectly fine. So in an artificial stone fabrication worker, simple silicosis is typically going to quickly progress to complicated silicosis, also known as progressive massive fibrosis or PMF. So similar to lymph node silicosis and simple silicosis, complicated silicosis or complex silicosis is best diagnosed via an HRCT scan or a biopsy. A treating doctor who has experience with silicosis may diagnose it with a chest X-ray or a CT scan, a regular CT scan, but quite often those scans may be found to be negative even in someone with complex silicosis. And so that's why an HRCT or high resolution CT reviewed by an expert B-reader radiologist is the best method for diagnosis, along with pathology or a biopsy. So a biopsy would be the treating doctor would typically go in via the throat, down into the lungs and take a sample. And the pathologist would review it under a microscope and make a determination. Typically, a worker with complex silicosis may also have pneumonia, or a treating doctor may misdiagnose their complex silicosis as pneumonia. They often have tuberculosis, or they may be misdiagnosed as tuberculosis when in fact it's complex silicosis. Any combination is quite normal of those diseases. And so the difficulty with complex silicosis, with progressive massive fibrosis, is the worker is suffocating. And so the only treatment is oxygen, and oxygen is not a cure. It's simply just a way to get more oxygen into those alveolar air sacs. So recall we talked about before that silicosis is a scarring disease where those alveolar air sacs get scarred over and no longer function. And so a worker with complex silicosis with progressive massive fibrosis, a large majority of their air sacs are scarred over and not working. And so oxygen health, because it increases the oxygen concentration in the alveolar air sacs that are still working, because it's providing a higher amount of oxygen than is in the normal air. The problem, of course, is that the worker is now tethered to 24/7 oxygen, and essentially their mobility is the length of the oxygen cord that is attached to either their tank or a concentrator. Whether the worker has lymph node silicosis or simple silicosis or chronic silicosis, or even complex silicosis, that is a very slow disease progression in a typical worker. With artificial stone workers, what we're finding is the process is accelerated. So we have accelerated silicosis. And so the worker is quickly going through the stages from lymph to simple to complex with progressive massive fibrosis in an accelerated fashion. And so a disease that might take decades in a typical worker, and in fact, the worker typically would not live long enough to develop the disease. In an artificial stone worker, the accelerated silicosis is developing within months to a few years. With accelerated silicosis in artificial stone workers. In addition to that, we see what's called acute silicosis, also sometimes known as PAP. Now, acute silicosis is very similar to complex silicosis with progressive massive fibrosis. The main difference is with acute silicosis, or PAP, the worker also develops fluid in their lungs, which makes it even harder to breathe because in addition to the scarred over alveolar air sacs, now their lungs have to contend to the fact that they're filled with fluid, right? Like someone might have with severe pneumonia. The second aspect of acute silicosis is that it develops very fast. And so a artificial stone worker, due to the very high levels of nano-sized silica coated with other toxins, the sort of witch's brew toxic soup that is exposing these workers, they can develop acute silicosis within only a few weeks or months of exposure. So whether the worker has complex silicosis or accelerated silicosis or acute silicosis or combination of any of those three, as I mentioned, that the only treatment is oxygen. There is no real cure. You could potentially call it a cure, but it's not fully a cure, which is a lung transplant. There's multiple problems with lung transplants being the cure for accelerated or acute or complex silicosis. The first problem is quite simply a donor needs to die with compatible lungs for a patient who qualifies to get the transplant in the first place. Secondly, the worker has to have access to competent medical care and specialized medical care because there's very few medical facilities that can even perform lung transplants. So, for example, in Southern California, there are 3 lung transplant possibilities. There's one in San Diego, but for example, there's none in Orange County. There's none in San Bernardino. So a worker has to be able to have access to medical care at a facility that can provide lung transplants in the first place. A donor has to die with compatible lungs. And the worker has to get on the transplant list, which means they have to qualify. They have to be sick enough to need it, but not so sick that they won't survive the transplant. So if a worker has access to a lung transplant facility and they qualify for a lung transplant, which means they're sick enough, but they're not too sick, and they don't have any comorbidities, such as being overweight or having HIV or having diabetes or significant cardiac problems, and a donor lung becomes available, then they may be lucky enough to have a lung transplant. The lung transplant surgery itself is a radical surgery. Many patients don't survive the surgery. Assuming they survive the surgery, it's many weeks to a few months of recovery from that surgery. And then most of us think of a organ transplant as sort of a one and done thing. And that might work with, say, a liver transplant or a kidney transplant. With your lungs, your body does not want those replacement lungs, and it immediately starts to try to reject those lungs. And so the lung transplant recipient has to take numerous medications, no exaggeration, around 50 different medications a day, including medications that are immunosuppressants to suppress the body's ability to reject those lungs. And even with those medication, the body over time is going to be successful in rejecting those lungs, such that on average, let's say 5 years on average, and with some people it may be 2 or 3 years, With some people, it may be 7 or 10 years, but on average, about 5 years, the body is going to be successful in rejecting those lungs. Then the worker either is going to die or they're going to need a second lung transplant. And so you can imagine if you're a worker and you're 30 years old and you are lucky enough to meet all the criteria to actually get a lung transplant and you survive the lung transplant, well, then you're going to need a second lung transplant at around 35 years old. 5 years after that, at 40, it's unheard of for someone to get a third lung transplant. So best case scenario, if you are a 30-year-old worker who needs a lung transplant, your best case scenario is that you're going to live to around 40 years old. So that is why I say that lung transplant is not really a cure. It's a life extender, and it's a very difficult life that the worker patient has. So the lung transplant as a supposed solution to accelerated or acute silicosis for an artificial stone fabrication worker is just not an effective solution. So next, in understanding what exactly is silicosis, particularly in artificial stone fabrication workers, is we need to understand the incidence of disease. In other words, how many stone fabrication workers are getting or will get accelerated silicosis. So there's been numerous published peer-reviewed studies throughout the world, starting in 2011 and up through 2023, where various groups of artificial stone workers have been studied, different size groups, some smaller, some larger, and amount of time spent fabricating stone, and various tools were utilized, most typically either a chest x-ray or regular CT scan. And the studies noted the prevalence rate. So among those studies, the lowest prevalence rate is just over 11%. Now, 11% to a layperson may seem low. It's actually quite high. An example would be if we look at only 1 in 10 heavy 2-pack-a-day smokers is going to get lung cancer, or 10%. Yet we still look at that from an epidemiological point of view as an epidemic. As another example, the traditional asbestos insulators, that group of workers, approximately 10% of them got mesothelioma. Again, that was considered epidemic levels. So again, if we look here at the prevalence studies for artificial stone fabrication workers developing silicosis, the lowest finding is 11%. And the finding ranges up to 54%, meaning if you look at a particular fabrication shop, over half those workers are going to get silicosis. Our own data indicates that the prevalence of artificial stone silicosis in fabrication workers is actually even higher than that. We're finding up to 80% of a fabrication shop workers have some level of silicosis. And so if we look at our own data showing that the rate of artificial stone accelerated silicosis in fabrication workers is as much as 80%, and we extrapolate that out across the country and think about how many fabrication shops there are in the U.S. and how many fabrication workers there are in the U.S., we can expect a significant amount of workers who have no idea that they are working with this product that is going to cause fatal disease are going to develop silicosis over the next several years. In addition to silicosis, including the various types of silicosis that artificial stone causes, artificial stone fabrication workers are also at an increased risk for several other diseases. And the first one is lung cancer. And quite simply, silica and the other components of artificial stone, in addition to being toxins that cause scarring, there are also carcinogens that cause cancer. Other diseases caused by artificial stone includes chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That's a difficult one because if anyone was a smoker, well, COPD is very commonly caused by cigarettes as well. Other diseases caused by artificial stone include chronic kidney disease, or CKD, and various autoimmune diseases, the most common of which is rheumatoid arthritis, or RA. Exposure to artificial stone also causes sarcoidosis. Now, sarcoidosis is a disease that is different from silicosis, but very similar. And so often a worker could be misdiagnosed with sarcoidosis, and actually what they have is silicosis. Or the worker could be diagnosed with sarcoidosis, and they also have silicosis. Like there's some specialists have coined a new term of ciliosarcoidosis to note the combination of the two in workers. And additionally, workers with silicosis are at an increased risk for tuberculosis, or TB. And so a worker with silicosis can have tuberculosis on top of that. Also, many workers with silicosis are misdiagnosed as having tuberculosis when they may have never even had that disease, what they had was silicosis. Silicosis can also leave workers subject to various other bacterial and fungal infections of the lungs. Today, we will discuss the hierarchy of controls and how those work, or in this case do not work, to prevent silicosis in artificial stone fabrication workers. In our last episode, we discussed the California Department of Public Health, and they have an online engineered stone silicosis surveillance dashboard. And at that point in time, in our last episode, they had documented 336 cases of artificial stone silicosis among these workers. Just this week, they've updated their dashboard to 358 workers. Just between our two episodes, a significant increase in artificial stone workers. Whether a fabrication shop is an incredibly unsophisticated, dusty, dry shop, or whether it's a more sophisticated wet shop, the issue is the worker breathing silica from artificial stone? And so in order to understand how a worker can be kept safe from silicosis, or really any other type of toxin or carcinogen in the workplace, we need to understand the hierarchy of controls. The hierarchy of controls is developed by the various health authorities, and this is the hierarchy of controls from NIOSH, which is the scientific wing of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. At the top of the inverse pyramid, the number one most efficient, best method to protect workers from disease, and in this case, to protect artificial stone workers from silicosis and similar diseases, is elimination. Elimination of the hazardous substance. So in this case, with artificial stone, eliminate the high content, high silica content, nano-sized silica, and other toxins and carcinogens that accompany artificial stone. And so, for example, the best way to eliminate that would be, for example, to use natural stone. That would eliminate the nano-sized, high-content silica coated with other carcinogens and toxins that the workers are breathing in when fabricating stone. In order to do that, the manufacturers and suppliers of the artificial stone slabs have to stop including this product in what they're selling. The second best method is similar to the first method, and that is simply substitution. So rather than manufacture and distribute artificial stone with high content silica that's coated with other toxins and carcinogens, include something else in the product. So for example, several manufacturers and distributors have developed so-called low silica artificial stone, and some have developed so-called no silica artificial stone. And if those products turn out to be safer after they're studied by science, and so it's too soon to know if they truly will be safer, but if they turn out to be safer, then those would be effective methods of elimination and substitution to protect fabrication workers in the workplace. The third level of protection in the hierarchy of controls is called engineering controls, and that's followed by administrative controls. These are methods that can be done in the workplace by the fabrication shop, employer, or hirer. The best example of engineering and administrative controls would simply be no dry cutting. If you can't eliminate or substitute the hazard, so if you're still using high content silica, artificial stone, the most important engineering and administrative control method is to not do dry cutting. Dry cutting releases the most amount of dust that is going to cause workers to get disease on the fastest pace. The next important method is to use wet equipment, wet sawing, wet polishing, and other wet equipment. The next method is to use local exhaust ventilation. So this is simply whatever method is being used to actually do the activity. So in this case, sawing, and in this case, wet sawing, to also add local exhaust ventilation to try to remove any of the dust that is released. Because the problem with using wet equipment, according to numerous published peer-reviewed studies from NIOSH and others, is that even when using wet equipment, the level of artificial stone silica released is still far too high, still far above the permissible exposure levels. The permissible exposure levels are not intended to be safe levels, but rather are intended to be regulatory levels, where if the workplace is above that level, well, then OSHA can issue a citation. But OSHA and NIOSH still expect to find high levels of disease such as silicosis and cancer in workers who are even operating at levels that are below the PEL. So if we go back to the hierarchy of controls, the final step and the least effective method is PPE, personal protective equipment. And in this case, when we're talking about PPE, we mean various types of respiratory devices. So the first most important thing when it comes to PPE is to wear it. So even if the worker is outside, to wear no mask at all is the absolute least safe method. Even if the worker is inside, and even if the worker is using wet equipment, a mask is still very much necessary. So a worker using wet equipment inside with no mask at all is still very much unsafe. Now, when it comes to what type of mask to wear, this is important as well. So a typical N95 mask, like we all became familiar with during COVID, is not effective at preventing silicosis. The silica particles that are released into the air are going to go right through an N95 mask. It's not going to be protective at all. The next level of mask protection would be a cartridge respirator. Now, a cartridge respirator is still problematic as well, and for several different reasons. First off, the worker has to undergo a health screening, which includes a pulmonary function test and other screening to make sure that they are essentially healthy enough to wear a mask. The next step is it has to be fit tested. So the mask has to fit their face. Some people have larger faces, some people have smaller faces. If you have a mask that doesn't fit your face, it's not going to be effective. The next issue is the worker cannot have any sort of beard or even stubble because the hair on the face would prevent a tight seal, and thus the silica particles can get right through the cartridge respirator. So in my case, for example, a cartridge respirator would not help me at all because of my beard. Next, the filter has to be a P100 filter, which is designed to be used with artificial stone. So, for example, you could have a mask, it could be fit tested, you could be clean shaven, but if you have a wrong filter, it's not going to be effective at preventing the silica particles from artificial stone from getting in. Now, this mask is actually pretty effective for natural stone. But again, remember the natural stone has silica particles that are, one, much less in content, there's much less of them, and two, they're much larger in size. And so a typical mask with a typical filter is going to stop most of the silica from natural stone. Finally, assuming you have the mask and it's fit tested and you're past the health test to wear it and you don't have a beard and you have the right filter, you still have to change the filter often enough. These filters, particularly in dustier environments, become clogged very fast, and then the filter is no longer effective. The mask is no longer effective. So the next level of respiratory protection, or PPE, is called a powered air purifying respirator. This is essentially a full helmet that goes completely, over the entire head, that is attached to a filtered mechanism so that the air that is breathing in is completely filtered. And again, that filter has to be the correct filter designed for artificial stone and has to be frequently changed because it gets overloaded. If it's the wrong type of filter or it's not frequently changed, then even the powered air purifying respirator is ineffective. The problem with every type of PPE, even the powered air purifying respirator, is when it comes to artificial stone, it's still not completely effective at protecting the worker from the silicosis particles, such that the best method would be a complete like NASA style moon suit, where the worker is completely protected from head to toe from the artificial stone particles, and they're connected to an actual oxygen line so that the air that they're breathing is perfect. And other than that worker completely protected, everything else is robotic equipment. So effectively, the only way to completely protect workers from artificial stone when fabricating it has been demonstrated by numerous published peer-reviewed studies from NIOSH, from OSHA, from Safe Work Australia, from Georgia Tech, from many others, is essentially to not have humans involved with fabrication of artificial stone. And that's why, if we go back to the hierarchy of controls, and we start at the bottom of the controls this time, we see that PPE, or personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, whether it's a N95 or a cartridge respirator or a powered air purifying respirator, are the least effective mechanisms. If we continue to go up the pyramid, administrative controls and engineering controls, such as using wet equipment, using exhaust ventilation, and using other engineering methods that can be quite expensive, are still not completely effective. That the most effective method to protect fabrication workers from silicosis and other diseases would be substitution and elimination of the high content nano-sized artificial stone, silica, and the other toxins and carcinogens that are in that product. And that is something that only the manufacturers and suppliers of the artificial stone can do. The manufacturer and supplier artificial stone slab defendants claim it's the process, not their product. But the reality is that stone fabrication to make countertops is not new. It's been around for many, many, many decades. What's new is the artificial stone product that was introduced into the existing fabrication market or industry or process. And the artificial stone is so significantly different than natural stone in that it has high content silica, nano-sized silica, and a whole bunch of other toxins and carcinogens mixed in with that nano-sized high content silica, that the traditional hierarchy of controls, starting at the bottom with PPE or personal protection, doesn't work. And the next level of controls with administrative and engineering controls, such as wet equipment and exhaust ventilation, don't work. That leaves us pointing the finger back at the artificial stone manufacturers and suppliers, saying you need to substitute or eliminate the high content nano-sized silica and other carcinogens and toxins from your product. And you know how to do this because you already make and sell low silica artificial stone and no silica artificial stone and natural stone. And so when we look at the traditional NIOSH OSHA hierarchy controls, it's you, the manufacturers and suppliers of artificial stone, that can keep workers safe, and you're choosing not to.
Next, we will discuss exactly why artificial stone is so much more hazardous to fabrication workers than natural stone. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the scientific reasons of why the hierarchy of controls work reasonably well for natural stone, but aren't effective at preventing accelerated silicosis and other disease when it comes to artificial stone. And so when it comes down to it, to a consumer or anyone else who's not an artificial stone fabrication worker, not in the industry, stone slabs look the same to us, right? We see them on a finished countertop. The stone slab looks the same regardless of what it's made from. In fact, not all stone slabs are created equal. And this is because when it comes down to it, the silica that is in these slabs is in fact not all the same. So we know this from a large body of global published peer-reviewed literature. Most importantly are several studies from Dr. Ramkisson in Australia and Dr. Cui from NIOSH. So most significantly, Dr. Ramkisson in Australia has published numerous articles. The most significant ones are an article for each of the last 4 years, an article from 2002, from 2023, from 2024, and 2025. Each focused on the characteristics of artificial stone and the dust that it produces in comparison to natural stone. Now, referring to Dr. Cui at NIOSH, he has done similar studies, not just looking at the constituents of the artificial stone, but also how the various engineering control methods work with different types of artificial stone and natural stone in terms of keeping or trying to keep the levels of dust below the PEL or permissible exposure level. And so Dr. Key has done a whole series of studies over many years, and here are some of them. So first of all, as we can see here from Dr. Cui, he's looking at various engineering and administrative controls, most importantly focused on water. So the first column is water spray alone, and you notice that his levels are at 300. Keep in mind that the PEL is 50 and the action level is 25. So showing that water spray alone is not an effective method of keeping the dust from artificial stone below the PEL. His next column is water spray plus sheet wetting, and he gets it down to 123, still far above the PEL. And finally, water spray plus improved ventilation and housekeeping at 71, notably still above the 50 PEL and 25 action. Now here we see further efforts to apply engineering controls and comparing ventilation with no ventilation and with improved ventilation. And notably, with the best scenario, able to get the levels reduced significantly lower, still above the PEL. Notably, they found that the most effective method, still not perfect, but the most effective method at keeping the levels relatively reduced were this method where they essentially flooded the slab with water. This method doesn't actually exist. It's not any mechanism that's sold even today, and is quite difficult to do if you think from a practical level, because it requires an intensive amount of water constantly flooding the slabs. So to understand the results of Dr. Ramkisson and Dr. Cui, we need to actually look at the underlying components of artificial stone versus natural stone, and artificial stone high content silica versus low content silica artificial stone. So the first thing to understand is that natural stone does contain silica, and at varying levels depending on the type of natural stone. So for example, marble contains less than 5% silica, granite contains less than 45% silica, as compared to high content artificial stone, which is 90 to 95% silica. However, there are certain natural stones that do contain high content silica. For example, quartzite is a natural stone that contains around 90% silica. So the high content silica is not the only issue. So while it's not the only issue, it is an important issue. And so, for example, if we look at Dr. Quee's findings, in this slide, he's comparing high silica content artificial stone to mid content artificial stone, to granite, which is a natural stone, and to recycled glass, or so-called no silica artificial stone. And so he's finding a significantly higher amount of respirable crystalline silica in the dust from the high silica artificial stone compared to the mid-level content silica artificial stone, which is roughly the same as the granite, and then all of those are significantly more than the recycled glass, supposed no silica content artificial stone. So just looking at the level of respirable crystalline silica produced from the stone when it's cutting, we see rather obviously compared to the content is that the highest content artificial stone is going to produce the most silica dust, and the reduced content artificial stone and natural stone is going to produce a mid-level of silica dust, and the no content artificial stone is going to produce almost no silica dust. So content is the first factor. The second factor is the size of the silica being produced. And to give you context, think about the size of salt, common table salt, which is about 100 microns. Okay? To actually be able to inhale a particle and have it be respirable down into your lungs, the largest that can be is 10 microns. So 1/10 the size of one table salt grain to be able to even breathe it into your lungs in the first place. Another way to think about it is that one human hair is about 50 microns. And again, for something to be breathable, respirable into the lungs, it has to be smaller than 10 microns. So now keep in mind that 10 microns is actually still quite relatively large when it comes to our lungs and breathing. And we get down to what's called ultrafine particles at 0.1 microns. And even those are still larger than the typical silica dust produced from artificial stone, which is typically 1/100th or smaller of 0.1 microns, nano-sized. So when artificial stone is made, it's made with quartz, which is a natural stone that's mined out of the ground, but then it is crushed and pulverized to nano-size before it is then mixed in with the other ingredients to make the artificial stone. So the end result is that the silica particles that are in artificial stone are so much smaller than the silica particles that are in natural stone. And when it comes to breathing, the smaller it is, the worse it is for you, because your body's defense mechanisms are pretty good at stopping large particles from getting through. It's the small stuff that gets through. That gets through the mass, that gets through your throat, that gets through your bronchial defense mechanisms and causes disease. And so that's the second factor that we know from Dr. Quee, Dr. Remkinson, and many other published peer-reviewed authors around the world on why artificial stone, as compared to natural stone or no content artificial stone, is causing such accelerated silicosis. So the first factor was the high content in artificial stone of the silica. The second factor is the nano size of that silica in artificial stone, whereas compared to, say, natural stone, for example. So, for example, quartzite, like artificial stone, has very high content silica. However, the size of the silica in quartzite is humongous compared to the size of the silica in artificial stone. So the third factor that we know from these published peer-reviewed studies is the other components of artificial stone. So the other components of artificial stone, so if we're talking high content artificial stone, the other 5 to 10% of the ingredients are metals, aluminums, copper, iron, magnesium, and various volatile organic compounds, otherwise known as toxins. So these toxins and metals combine with the silica in artificial stone to cause disease. And so what Dr. Remkinson is finding is that in artificial stone, the other ingredients, the volatile organic compounds, the metals, are often coating the silica dust that is released during fabrication. And so if you can think of an analogy, it's kind of like throwing gasoline on a fire. Like the only thing worse than a toxin and a carcinogen is combining it with another toxin and carcinogen. And conversely, Dr. Remkison finds that in the non-artificial stone, the silica that is released, and again, it's not as small, it's much larger, it often is coated with relatively benign other constituents of natural stone. In other words, the silica released from natural stone is lower in content typically, but even with something like quartzite, where it's high in content, just like artificial stone, it's smaller in size than the nano-sized artificial stone, and often it's coated with a something that is benign, that is non-toxic to the body, because natural stone contains more than just silica; it contains other natural components. And so those natural components, Dr. Remkison found, are essentially coating and enveloping that otherwise toxic silica particle. And so these three reasons, high content, nano size, and the other toxins and carcinogens in artificial stone as compared to natural stone or mid-content artificial stone or no silica content artificial stone, show us why the high content artificial stone is causing so much artificial accelerated silicosis and other diseases in fabrication workers when we haven't seen that level of disease in workers before. Another way of saying it is the process of artificial stone fabrication has been around for a very long time. And that process hasn't changed, and it's gradually improved over the years with better safety mechanisms, with masks and wet equipment and so forth. And people like Dr. Cui at NIOSH and many others around the world have published peer-reviewed studies showing that those mechanisms work and have worked and worked for decades reasonably well in keeping artificial stone, or in keeping fabrication workers safe, relatively safe from disease. That we did not see very much silicosis in fabrication workers until something changed. What changed? The artificial stone slab manufacturers introduced this artificial stone product into the existing market. And so fabrication workers went from fabricating natural stone to fabricating this artificial stone with no warnings that this was something different. And in fact, being told up through today by the slab manufacturers that the various engineering and administrative control mechanisms recommended for natural stone, they're being falsely told that those mechanisms work with artificial stone. But we know from the studies of Dr. Cui, Dr. Remkison, and many others throughout the world that in fact, when they actually are looking at these methods under a microscope and looking at the dust that's produced and looking what's in the dust and looking at the amount of the dust, they see that the levels of dust produced, even when using these protective methods, when fabricating artificial stone, are still far above the PEL. And then what is in the dust is so significantly much more dangerous for the workers in the first place.
This podcast contains subjective commentary and opinion-free speech intended to provoke thought and discussion. Investigative commentary intended to shed light on matters of public interest to inform the audience and encourage civic engagement, accountability, and transparency. Findings that are a result of diligent research, fact-checking, and analysis of publicly available material, including news reports, public records, interviews, personal research, experiences, published peer-reviewed medical and scientific literature, published governmental health authority regulations and findings, and other accessible sources. Any conclusions drawn reflect the creator's interpretation of that information and are presented in good faith, and are not intended to malign, defame, or harm the reputation of any individual, group, company, or entity, but rather are intended to be allegations acknowledged to be disputed by artificial stone slab manufacturers and suppliers. The speech herein is protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Litigation privilege, CA-CC 47B. Fair reporting privilege, CA-CC 47D1. Anti-SLAPP, CCP 425.16. And fair use doctrine, Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. This podcast and all content herein are exclusive property of Brayton Purcell LLP and are protected under applicable copyright and trademark laws. Unauthorized use, reproduction, distribution, or exploitation of this content in whole or in part without express written permission is strictly prohibited. All rights reserved.